Hello everyone. Today I'm excited to share with you my pattern and process to make these good and evil inspired dresses. Now I actually watched Netflix's School of Good and Evil last November and started on these dresses in December. But these last few weeks have been so crazy. But I've finally gotten around to editing the footage and I'm very excited to share it with you. Now when I was watching School of Good and Evil, I really couldn't decide what I liked better, the evil dresses or the good dresses. And I loved so much of the over-the-top fashion that characters like Sophie, Agatha, Beatrix, and Hester wore. I really couldn't decide. So what I wanted to do was make a pattern that could be used to make either an evil dress or a good dress, just depending on the fabrics and trim that I chose. And as an extra challenge, I wanted to use only things I already had on hand and sort of focus on stash busting. And I'm so excited to share the finished products with you. And of course, if you like these dresses and want to make a dress like this for yourself, definitely check out my Etsy shop where I've put the PDF pattern. But otherwise, let's get into it. Now to begin, let's talk about the materials used for both dresses. I was a bit challenged since I wanted to use only materials I already had in my stash. So for my good dress, I used approximately 5.5 meters of this cotton that has a pink grid in the background with small roses and butterflies printed all over. I used an additional 1 meter of a heavier weight white cotton to back the bodice pieces of my dress, because the white cotton with the flowers and butterflies was just a little bit see-through and I wanted to add a little bit more weight to my bodice. I also used a 60 centimeter white zipper, matching thread, and about 20 meters of this light pink eyelet trim and about 11 meters of this floral trim. I also used about 3.5 meters of wriggling boning. For my evil dress, I used approximately 5.5 meters of this poly blended black brocade fabric, a 60 centimeter zipper, matching thread, a rose patch, about 5 meters of black lace approximately 3 centimeters wide, and about 12 meters of 1 centimeter wide black lace. I also used about 2 meters of black ribbon to create the faux corset waist, and about 3.5 meters of wriggling boning. Next, let's get the pattern ready. Now the pattern for this dress is available in my Etsy shop, and the pattern for the bodice and the skirt are separate PDFs. So you will need to choose which paper size you want to print on, A4 or US letter, and then print the PDF for the bodice and the PDF for the skirt. After printing the PDFs, be sure to check the measurement on the box on the first page, and if the measurement looks good, you can then begin assembling the pattern. To assemble the pattern, you will want to cut the edges of the pages off and then tape the pages together to create a grid. The pattern for the bodice is 30 pages total, with 6 pages across and 5 pages down to create a 30-page grid. And the pattern for the skirt is 42 pages, 7 pages across and 6 pages down for 42 pages total. Next, you will choose your size and then cut the pattern pieces out to your size. Now my bust is approximately 38 inches, so I will be cutting out size 38. The sizes of this pattern are labeled by the bust size in inches. And here are all of my pattern pieces cut out. Now after cutting my pattern pieces out, I'm going to make a mock-up. and I highly recommend you make a mock-up too. A mock-up is a great way to check the fit and fine-tune the pattern to make sure it fits your body before cutting into any expensive dress fabric. You may want to make some slight adjustments so that the pattern fits you better. I used some leftover cotton to make my mock-up and tried it on to test the fit. When trying on my mock-up, I also decided that I wanted to place a little boning in the seams of my bodice. You could go without boning if you prefer, or you could add a different type of boning. I will talk more about this later. I also marked the actual neckline with a marker. After you sew in the lining to the bodice, it will make the neckline about 1.5 centimeters lower. I wanted to keep this in mind when planning for my lace and trim. And once I was satisfied with my mock-up, I moved on to cutting my pattern pieces out of my dress fabric. For my evil dress, I opened my fabric up to its full width. Then I folded it in half so that there was 2 layers of fabric with one folded edge. And I placed my skirt front on that folded edge. Now I only had to cut my skirt back, bodice front, sleeve band, and sleeve one time from the 2 stacked layers of fabric. But I had to be a bit more strategic with my other bodice pieces, that way I could cut enough for both the lining and the outer layer. Now you may wish to purchase a little extra fabric if you want lining from the same fabric as your dress fabric, but I was able to squeeze it all out of this 5.5 meters. For my good dress, I opened my fabric up to the full width and cut each skirt piece separate, one at a time. This was because the fabric has that pink grid for the background, and I wanted to take extra care and try to line up the grid as best as I could for the skirt pieces. After cutting my skirt back pieces, I cut my skirt front on the fold, again doing my best to match up those pink grid lines. From the remaining fabric, I cut out my bodice pieces and squeezed out my matching lining. I also cut 1 layer of bodice pieces from a thicker white cotton, which I'm going to use to back the outer layer of my bodice. This will sort of act like an interlining and add a little body to my bodice. Next, we can see all of my pattern pieces cut out. I have 1 skirt front cut on the fold, 2 skirt back pieces, 2 sleeves, 2 sleeve bands, 3 bodice fronts, 1 for the outer layer, 1 for lining, and 1 from white cotton, 6 bodice middle fronts, 2 for the outer layer, 2 for lining, and 2 from white cotton, 6 bodice side fronts, 6 bodice side backs, 6 bodice middle backs, and 6 bodice backs. Again, 2 for the outer layer, 2 for lining, and 2 from the white cotton. With everything cut out, I can now start assembling the bodice. But first, I want to match the outer layer of my bodice pieces to the white cotton layer and pin these 2 layers together. I am using this white cotton fabric to back my outer layer of fabric, like a layer of interlining. The cotton fabric I am using for this dress is fairly see-through, so I wanted to add the white cotton, that way the bodice would have a little more body to it and not be as see-through it. That's why I'm backing the outer layer of my dress bodice with this white cotton. Now I did not add an interlining layer to my evil dress. The black brocade has enough body and is not see-through, so this is totally optional. If I had used a different fabric for my good dress, it may not have been necessary. Once every bodice piece is pinned to the cotton backing, I can now move on and start assembling the bodice. Using 1.5 centimeters of seam allowance, I am going to sew the bodice front to the bodice middle front, and then the bodice middle front to the bodice side. Next, I'm going to sew the bodice back to the bodice middle back, and the bodice middle back to the bodice side back. You can go ahead and sew the bodice sides together, but I want to leave my sides unsewn for a moment. That way it's easier to add some trim on top of the bodice. So again, I'm going to use 1.5 centimeters of seam allowance and sew my bodice front to my bodice middle front and my bodice middle front to my bodice side. And I'm going to work very carefully and slowly along the curved edges. Once finished, this is what it should look like. And then I'm going to repeat this for the other side of my bodice front. Next, I'm going to sew my bodice back to my bodice middle back and my bodice middle back to my bodice side back. And again, repeat this for the other side of my bodice back. Once my bodice front and two backs are sewn and completely assembled, I match them together with right sides touching and pin the shoulder edges to one another. After pinning the shoulder edges together, I sew them together, creating a seam at the shoulder. The next thing I'm going to do is trim all of the seams on my bodice with my pinking shears. This is because after I finish trimming all of the seam allowance with my pinking shears, I'm going to press with an iron all of these seams open. I want them to lie smooth and flat against the body. You may prefer a different finishing method for your seams, but because I'm adding the lining, this works perfectly well for me. Now I'm ready to start adding some trim to my bodice. First, I want to figure out where I want to place the trim on my bodice, and I decided I wanted to do something similar to my witch dress that I made last October. Starting at the back waist edge of my bodice, I use a ruler and chalk to draw a line that travels up the back of the bodice, over the shoulder, and down the front of the bodice. I will be using this chalk line as a guide for where to place my trim. After I draw this chalk line on one half of my bodice, I fold my bodice in half and place pins where that chalk line is. I'm going to pin through all layers of my fabric, and I will be using these pins to help me redraw the chalk line on the other side of my bodice, since I want this line to mirror the first chalk line. Once the second chalk line is drawn, I will remove the pins and open my bodice up. You may wish to first place and pin your trim to your bodice, but I went ahead and took it straight to my sewing machine, and I just used that chalk line as a guide. Following the chalk line, I top stitch some pink eyelet trim down. Then I go back and add a second line of eyelet trim on the opposite side. I finally cover up the center of this pink eyelet trim with a floral trim, covering the middle bit. I stitch carefully on either side of the floral trim, top stitching it down in place to the bodice. I repeat this for the other side of the bodice, so I have a row of stacked trim that runs over both shoulders. I I use a basting stitch to sew around the entire neckline of my bodice. This way, both layers are secured to one another. Next, I go back and add some gathered eyelet around the neckline of my bodice, and I use my seam ripper to gently push the eyelet underneath the foot of the sewing machine, and I just top stitch it down in place. There's definitely a better way to do this, but it's just how I did it. And finally, my bodice is finished and decorated, so I match the side front to the side back together, and I stitch that side seam, finishing it off by trimming it with pinking shears and then pressing it open. And here you can see what my bodice looks like once it's all sewn together and the trim has been added. You can also see the eyelet that I have gathered around the neckline, that once I add the lining to this bodice, the ruffled eyelet will sort of turn upwards. Now I will sew my bodice pieces together to create the bodice lining. I will sew bodice front to bodice middle front, bodice middle front to bodice front side, bodice front side to bodice back side, bodice back side to bodice middle back, and bodice middle back to bodice back. And again, I'm going to trim these seams with pinking shears and press them open. Now to add boning. I will be adding wriggling boning to the seams of my bodice lining. But boning is totally optional. You can make a dress without boning if you want. However, boning will help add structure and support to the bodice of the dress and may help create a more fitted look. You also have a lot of flexibility with the type of boning you add and the way you add it. I already had pieces of wriggling boning on hand, so that's what I decided to use. Wriggling boning is sort of an easy to use boning. It's polyester which is braided about plastic rods, and it's also the only boning that can be sewn directly to fabric. Wriggling is also available at many craft stores. You could, however, opt for featherlight boning or plastic boning that comes in a cotton casing. This plastic boning with a cotton casing is also very easy to add and sew directly into the fabric. You could also use bias tape or twill tape to create your own boning channels. You would simply sew the tape to the interlining or lining layer of your bodice and insert the boning of your choice. There's really a lot of room to experiment with boning, depending on how cinched you want your dress to look. You could really experiment with what type of boning you use and how you add it to the dress. That is up to you and your preference. Again, I will be adding wriggling to the seams of my lining. I simply cut my wriggling boning to the appropriate length, making sure that the boning is about 3 centimeters from the edges of my lining. After cutting the boning, I used a lighter to gently melt the ends of my plastic boning so that there's not sharp edges. This is a pretty tricky and dangerous method, so I probably would not recommend what I'm doing. You are likely to burn your little fingers, so please take care. You may prefer to carefully cut or file your boning ends. Once my boning is ready and cut to length, I go to the machine and very carefully and very slowly stitch the boning directly to my lining. You want to be very slow and very careful because you do not want to break a needle here. I carefully stitch on either side of the boning, securing it to the lining of my bodice, again sewing very close to the edges. After the boning has been sewn to the lining, I match the shoulder edges of my bodice together, right sides touching, and sew. And then I finish this shoulder seam by trimming with my pinking shears and pressing open. Once the lining is finished, we can set it aside, and now we can add sleeves to our bodice. First, I'm going to sew a gathering line of stitches along the bottom edge of my sleeve, as well as the sleeve head. Set your machine to a straight stitch on the longest length and then sew along the bottom edge of the sleeve and around the curve edge of the sleeve head. This will be to create the gathering line of stitches. I will be pulling the threads of these lines of stitches to gather down the sleeve. Once we've added our gathering stitches, let's add the sleeve band to the bottom edge of the sleeve. I'm going to pull these loose threads on the gathering line of stitches along the bottom edge of the sleeve to gather up the sleeve so that it is the same length as the sleeve band. As I pull the threads to gather it up, I'm going to gently use my fingers to push the gathers evenly along the bottom edge. I want to space the gathers evenly until the sleeve's bottom edge is the same length as my sleeve band. Next, I'm going to flip my sleeve over so that the right side is facing down and the wrong side is facing up. Then I will lie my sleeve band on top of the sleeve, matching the bottom edges of the sleeve band to the bottom edge of the sleeve. I want the right side of the sleeve band facing the wrong side of the sleeve, so both wrong sides of sleeve band and sleeve will be facing up. I then pin the sleeve band to the sleeve, matching the bottom edges to one another. Next, I can stitch the sleeve to the sleeve band, working very carefully as I sew over top my created gathers. After I sew the sleeve band to the sleeve, I will now do a bit of folding to create the bottom edge of the sleeve with the sleeve band. First, I fold and press the seam allowance down towards the sleeve band. Next, I fold the sleeve band up 2 times. The first fold is to hide its raw edge of the sleeve band, and the second fold is to finish the sleeve edge. I position the folded sleeve band just over top the gathers and pin it in place. This will cover and hide the previous stitching and create a finished edge for the bottom of your puff sleeve. All that's left to do is top stitch the sleeve band in place. I skipped adding pins and just went straight to the machine, but for a bit more stability, I recommend using pins. After I made the bottom edge of my sleeve, I decorated the band using 2 rows of eyelet and a final top row of the floral trim. I also forgot to add my gathering line of stitches at my sleeve head earlier, like I mentioned, so I took a quick moment and added the gathering line of stitches to my sleeve head. Next, I folded my sleeve in half, matching the side edges to one another with right sides touching, and then pinned and stitched that side edge. After stitching, I trimmed the seam allowance and finished the raw edge with a zigzag stitch, and I repeated this for my other sleeve. Now that both of my sleeves are finished, I am ready to attach them to my bodice. To add my sleeves to the bodice, I am first going to match the side seams of my bodice to the side seam of my sleeve, again with right sides touching. I will then pin the sleeve to the bodice. Now working up from either side of the sleeve, I am going to smoothly set the sleeve into the bodice's armhole and pin it in place. Again, I want to keep the underside of my sleeve smooth against the bodice. I am going to pin the sleeve smooth to the bodice until I reach my last seam on both the front and back of my bodice. This seam is where the bodice front is sewn to the bodice middle front and the bodice back is sewn to the bodice middle back. This will be the upper part of the sleeve that goes over your shoulder. I am now going to pull the threads on the gathering line of stitches that I added to my sleeve head earlier. I'm going to gather down the sleeve head so it is the same length as the top of my armhole. As I pull the threads, I gently adjust the placement of the gathers so that the gathers are evenly spaced. And slowly, the sleeve head will be able to be eased and fitted into the armscye. You can then pin the sleeve in place, again making sure that the gather placement looks good over top your shoulder. And here you can see my sleeve pinned into the armhole of my bodice. The underside of my sleeve has been pinned smoothly against the underside armhole of my bodice, and the head of my sleeve has been gathered down to fit the shoulder of my bodice, all of it pinned in place. Once my sleeve has been pinned into the armhole, I will take it to the machine and stitch it in place, carefully working around the armscye as I sew. To finish the raw edge, I trimmed the extra seam allowance with my pinking shears and zigzag stitched the raw edge. And now my sleeve has been added to my bodice, and I can repeat this for the other sleeve on the other side of my bodice. And here you can see my bodice now that both sleeves have been added. You can see the gathers at the top of the shoulder and how the rest of the sleeve is set smoothly into the armhole. And here is how everything looks on the dress mannequin. I'm pretty happy with how everything is turning out. So we can keep moving on and start assembling the skirt. First, I sew my skirt back to my skirt front. I match the side seams of my skirt front to my skirt back with right sides touching. And then I pin these edges together and stitch. I finished the raw edge with a zigzag stitch. And I took a little extra time here since I wanted the pink grid on my skirt to match as best as possible. Next, I added gathering stitches to the top edge of my skirt. Starting at the gray dot and going to the center back of my skirt, I stitched in a line of gathering stitches on the longest length. This gathering line of stitches will help me gather down my skirt's top edge to fit my bodice's waist edge later. Next, I match the top edge of my skirt to the waist edge of my bodice with right sides together. I start by pinning the center front of my skirt to the center front of my bodice, and then I work my way outwards towards the center back pinning. The pointed center front of my bodice should be pinned smooth against the center front of my skirt. The gathers will begin at the seam where the bodice front is joined to the bodice middle front. Here, I gather down the top edge of my skirt so it is the same length as my bodice's waist edge, and I pin these two edges together. As I gather down the skirt, I try to evenly smooth and spread the gathers. As you pull the gathering threads, you want to be gentle so that you don't break the threads. Again, work slowly and carefully, especially on the center front. It can sometimes be a little tricky and fussy trying to match the center front of the bodice to the center front of the skirt. Take your time here and match the skirt to the bodice, and once you are satisfied with how everything is in place, then you can take it to the machine and stitch. If you are really struggling here, you may find that first hand basting and then machine sewing will help. I also find that starting your stitching at the center front and sewing from the center front to the center back is another great strategy. As you sew the center fronts together, make sure your skirt is smooth and flat against the bodice without any puckering or scrunching. And here you can see the entire top edge of my skirt gathered down and pinned to the waist edge of my bodice. The center front of my skirt is smooth against the center front of my bodice, and everything is pinned and ready to be taken to the machine and stitched. And as I am stitching the skirt to my bodice, I am just taking care as I sew over top my gathers, making sure that everything is evenly placed and I am happy with it. Again, I want to take care over the smooth center front, make sure that there's no puckering or scrunching. Once you are happy with the skirt sewn to your bodice, you can then finish the seam. I finished my seam by trimming the seam allowance with pinking shears, pressing the seam allowance up towards the bodice and top stitching it down. Now that the skirt has been added to the bodice, we can begin finishing the dress. I am next going to add my lining. I match my lining's neckline to my bodice's neckline with right sides touching. I take care to match the center fronts, the center backs, and seams as I pin the necklines together. Next, I sew my necklines together. As I sew, I am taking extra care to sew over top my previous line of stitching where I added the lace trim. I want the bottom edge of my lace trim to be sandwiched between my lining and my bodice front layer. So as I sew the lining to my bodice, I take care to make sure I am sewing over top the line of stitching, sort of using it like a guide. Next, I trim the seam allowance around my neckline with my pinking shears. Then I press the seam allowance to my bodice lining and understitch it. Just a little bit beneath my stitching where I have added the lining to my bodice, I will stitch the seam allowance to my bodice lining. This should help turn the neckline a little more smooth and help the lace I have added to the neckline pop up. After understitching, I turn my bodice to the right side out and press the neckline with an iron, making everything neat and smooth. Next, I will add a zipper to the center back of my dress. You could opt for a different back closure if you prefer, but I am going to add this zipper. First, I fold my dress in half and match the center back edges to one another with right sides touching. Then I pin the center back edges of my dress together. As you can see, the lining for my bodice is folded away and the center back edges have not been pinned together for the lining. I will not be sewing the lining, but later hand sewing. So I started at the neckline of my bodice and I have pinned down the entire center back of my dress. I have also measured and marked with blue chalk where on the center back of my dress my zipper will end. This is because I am going to stitch using a long length basting stitch, starting at the neckline of my dress, going down to where I have marked in chalk where my zipper will end. At this mark, I am going to change to a regular stitch and continue sewing down the center back of my dress. The basting stitch is where I will be placing my zipper, and later on I will be removing these stitches. It might sound a bit odd, but hang tight, it will make sense. Next, I press that center back seam that I just created open. Now I am going to place my zipper right into the center back of my dress, right where I have created that seam. I place my zipper down, the right side facing the seam, and pin it in place. You want the zipper teeth to be nestled in the center back seam. Once my zipper is pinned in place, I change to the zipper foot on my sewing machine and stitch my zipper in place. Now you may prefer to first pin your zipper in place and then hand baste before taking it to the machine. Basting first is a great way to make sure you have your zipper placed correctly, and it will prevent getting poked lots of times when you are machine stitching the zipper. I just went straight to the machine after pinning my zipper in place, and it was a lot of fuss. Stitching a zipper can be very tricky, so I recommend working very slowly and carefully. Again, if you're struggling, just hand baste it and then machine stitch it. Once I have sewn both sides of my zipper into the center back of my dress, I can now turn my dress right side out and start removing those basting stitches in the center back. I'm going to work carefully here so I don't seam rip something I don't mean to, and as I remove these basting stitches, I will be able to open and pull my zipper down. Afterwards, feel free to add a few stitches to secure the bottom or top of your zipper. Once your zipper is added, it is now a great time to try on the dress and check the length. You may wish to trim the bottom edge of your dress to suit your height better. Really, I recommend checking the measurements of the skirt pattern before cutting into your fabric, but you may want to try it on again and give it a second look. I am perfectly satisfied with the length of my dress, so I'm just going to add a simple double fold hem to the bottom edge. I will simply fold the bottom raw edge up 2 times and stitch it down. The bottom edge is folded 2 times so that the raw edge is totally hidden, and I just work around the entire bottom edge of my dress, hemming it up with that simple double fold. Once I've added my bottom hem, I decide I'm going to add some trim to the bottom edge of my dress. I measure up 15 centimeters and 30 centimeters and mark with chalk. I work around the entire bottom edge of my dress, measuring and marking the 15 and 30 centimeters. This way I can use these marks as guides to place my trim. Then I add the trim. I sew 2 rows of eyelet with the floral trim 30 centimeters up from the bottom edge, and I repeat this 15 centimeters up from the bottom edge. I add a little eyelet trim to the bottom edge of my dress as well. And finally, all that's left to do is hand sew the bodice lining. I carefully lay and pin the bodice lining in place. I take care to make sure the seams of my bodice and the lining are matching, and I pin everything carefully in place as I fold the edges inward. I want to hide the raw edges of my lining against the bodice. Once my lining has been pinned in place on the inside of my dress, I can carefully hand stitch the lining to my dress. I take extra care when hand sewing the lining along my zipper because I want to place the lining close to the zipper, but not so close that it will cause any issues or catch in the zipper. I also stitch the lining along the waistline and armholes as well, taking care to gently hand stitch the lining to the seam allowance of the dress. That way, none of the stitches show through to the outside layer. Now, this final step can take a little bit of time, but it is well worth it. It creates a tidy finish to the inside of the dress, and you may wish to change the lining to be a facing, or even instead bind the neckline of your dress and omit a lining altogether. Feel free to experiment. A lot of this is to your preference and taste. Since I added wriggling boning to my dress lining, it was necessary to stitch the lining in place and be very particular. And with that, my good dress was complete. Now, the construction for my evil dress is much the same, but I quickly want to chat about a few points in the process. Before sewing the seams of my bodice, I first added some ribbon to the bodice front piece. I cut and pinned the ribbon in place to create a sort of faux corset front. After pinning the ribbon in place, I stitched the ribbon to the front of the bodice, and then I stitched the rest of my seams together to create the bodice. The poly blend brocade I used for my evil dress was also much thicker with more body, so I did not need to add a layer of interlining to help bolster the bodice. The bodice for the evil dress is simply 2 layers, one layer for the outer layer and the second layer for lining. The lining layer also has wriggling boning sewn into the seams. Both the bodice outer layer and the lining are cut from the same black brocade dress fabric. I also added a row of 3 cm lace to the sleeve band with a smaller 1 cm lace over top. The neckline I tinkered with adding red crocheted lace, but ultimately opted to use all black lace. I added the 3 cm lace around the neckline and I topped it with the 1 cm wide lace. I used a little fabric glue and hand stitched to secure the rose patch to the center front of my dress. And this patch was something I just randomly had on hand and I thought would add a little more drama and glamour to the dress. Finally, I used the last of my black lace to decorate the waist, front seams, and the hem of my dress. And with that, both my good and my evil dresses were complete. Which dress do you like better? And which school would you rather be in? Would you rather be good or evil? And thank you so much for watching. If you like this video and would like to see other fun DIY videos, definitely like and subscribe. Thank you. Bye.